Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast, Season 3, Episode 4. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion. Where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. A smorgasbord episode, 5 minutes on East Palestine. We touch on further examples of failing up, the Alec Murdaugh trial, the Tucker Carlson revelations about insurrectionists being escorted through the Capitol building, short-term liabilities, incompetence if you will, turn out to be long-term assets, the capacity to turn the quote-unquote mistakes into lucrative, and I mean lucrative additional funding. I started a cleanse, and we're going to wrap it up with a segment that I believe is going to be ongoing throughout the course of this season of the podcast, money. A subject that there's a lot of talk out there in the social media space and the public about. I'm not sure how honest I personally feel about a lot of that talk. I feel there's a lot of insecurity and a lot of shame around money and people's personal finances, and it's time to start opening that up and exploring it, so that there isn't another generation of people that are going into their 60s and 70s without enough money to retire the way that they want, to stop working when they want to. Thank you again to all of my loyal listeners. I have recently learned that it's actually extremely detrimental to the podcast to take a 2 or 3 month break and not have the continuity that listeners appreciate, that a lot of listeners demand in order to keep listening. So for those of you that are continuing to listen, and I know that there's some out there because I'm seeing the downloads and the clicks, I do appreciate it. That brings me to my Patreon page. If you'd like me to continue to podcast throughout the course of the year, give me some money. This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast on Patreon. If I could outsource some of this grunt work, I might be able to keep that continuity going, which would probably be good for not only the podcast, but my own development as a podcaster. Enough of that. Let's get on to the main show.
Act 1, 5 minutes on East Palestine.
I'm not going to get excited about it anymore. I'm not going to get mad. I'm not going to make demands. Nothing could better illustrate the point that I continue to make, that there's no difference between the political parties in this country, in the United States, in the 21st century, than the debacle that is East Palestine and Norfolk Southern's derailment there. You've got a Republican governor, you've got a Democrat in the White House, and you've got a boob, a literal boob. I mean, I don't know that Pete Buttigieg is ever going to have the political career that he thought he was after this just absolutely disastrous reign as head of the Department of Transportation. That's a whole nother segment for a whole nother time. In my legal career, I've had many an opportunity to work with the Environmental Protection Agency. And what I always find hilarious is how invasive they are to the little guy. If you don't have any political power, if you don't have any money, the EPA can be your worst nightmare. They can be extremely invasive. It's expensive to go through the administrative process with the EPA. But look at the circumstance that you find in East Palestine, and isn't that one of the most compliant agencies that you've ever seen in your entire life? And if you weren't looking at a calendar, if you weren't looking at the political landscape, if you were just looking in a vacuum, you would think that it was a Republican president that was in office, given how deferential the Environmental Protection Agency has been to Norfolk Southern in its, I don't even know if you could call it a cleanup, in its haphazard remediation efforts in East Palestine. Even Donald Trump, who saw it as a great opportunity to interject himself through the media, through political circles, by going to East Palestine, refused to hold Norfolk Southern's feet to the fire in his speech or in any other media interviews that he's given. There really is no difference between the political parties in the 21st century. So for the sake of this podcast and the sake of entertaining current events, I'll speak to it. But what's the point of getting upset? What's the point of actually breaking down what this politician did, what this bureaucrat did? It's all the same. You are seeing in real time these people, Democrats, Republicans, people in high office, mayors, governors, high-level bureaucrats, hell, the President of the United States of America. Non-issue, or to the extent that they try to address the issue, it's, hey, we think Norfolk Southern, they're doing a bang-up job. It's hard for me now to be animated about any of these situations because it's just routine. It's becoming habit. It's a cycle. You want to break the cycle, dear listener? I do. Let's get back to the hashtag vote against the incumbent. The issue with the railroads, it really started in the Obama administration. The Obama administration, hope and change, they were so cooperative with these railroad companies. They were more than willing to reduce, if not eliminate, many of the safety features, many of the requirements that the railroads had in order to operate, and that was just taken up by the Trump administration. You could interchange the presidents and all of the bureaucrats that they appointed, and by way of the lack of legislation or the elimination of legislation, of restrictions, you wouldn't know the difference. It's ludicrous, it's cartoonish to go back and forth on these individual incidents that were manifested over the course of years by what are policies from different administrations, different political parties that are exactly the same, and to point fingers and say it's this person's fault simply because when the actual consequences befell the city, the county, this population of people, it's the person in power that's responsible. There is no hope and change. No one is going to make America great again. No one is restoring normalcy to the office of President of the United States. Vote against the incumbent.
Act 2: The Murdaugh murder trial segues nicely into a comment on the Capitol Police.
I can't get too animated about this case either. For years, the police were well aware of Jerry Sandusky. For years, the police were well aware of Bill Cosby. For years, the police were well aware of Jeffrey Epstein. The FBI basically had Larry Nassar dead to rights. Over the course of time, their crimes just got more and more heinous, more and more egregious. They had no fear of reprimand, of repercussion. You see that dysfunction in the way the Murdaugh family operates, their interpersonal dynamic, just permeate out into the county, and that dysfunction with the legal system, with law enforcement. It's the through line. It's the common thread in all of these cases. These people didn't live quiet, healthy home lives. The Murdaugh case is particularly interesting because basically you had a family full of drug addicts. They were all alcoholics. And if you've been around anyone who is an alcoholic or someone who just drinks too much, let's take out the alcoholic part. Let's just say that they drank too much. You've been around people that you like and that you care about that drink too much, and they clearly aren't the same person after having imbibed said drinks than they are when they're sober. All the irritability and the pettiness and the paranoia, it's easy to sit here and speculate as to why they were all alcoholics and why they had the problems that they did. I don't know that it matters. I don't know that that's an issue that we really need to concern ourselves with, because they routinely allowed their actions, because of whatever pain they were in, whatever trauma they were trying to overcome, they routinely let their actions through the use of alcohol and perhaps other substances spill over into civil society. That's why we have law enforcement. I don't look at the case of the Murdaughs in South Carolina any different than I would one of these mass shootings in the city of Chicago. I don't see any difference. Yes, one of them's in an urban area, one of them's in a rural area. One of them is with people who are in a socio-economically depressed environment, very likely fighting over drug territory. The other, drug addicts, alcoholics, with too much privilege. And you can say, well, in one scenario, it's because of their status and their privilege that law enforcement gives them a pass. And in the other, the city is so overwhelmed with violence that law enforcement gives them a pass. Okay, what's the difference? In substance, what's the difference? You want to sit there and argue over the rationale, the reasons why it leads up to the result? I'm concerned about the result. I'm concerned about the result in every one of these cases where you see law enforcement put their finger on a criminal, on a Jerry Sandusky, on a Jeffrey Epstein, on a Bill Cosby. They have a Larry Nassar well in their sights. They don't do anything about it. Does it take a drug addict staging his own murder and then turning around and murdering his son and his wife? Is that what it takes to get law enforcement's attention? Boy, have I bashed social media on this podcast over the course of the 3 years that I've been doing it. But here's one of those scenarios where social media is an asset. It's an ally to the public good. These cases can't stay dormant. They can't stay in the dark, but for so long. Social media will not allow for as much. The true winners in this situation are true crime fans, because you give it another 24, 36 months, and there's going to be another story like this. There'll be another Netflix series. There'll be another cover-up. There'll be an analysis of all the different incidents that should have led law enforcement to a prosecution much earlier. Let's just hope for our sake, dear listener, that we're not one of the victims. Speaking of victims, let's talk about the Capitol Police and the January 6th riot, insurrection, whatever you want to call it. My interpretation hasn't changed. The Capitol Police were derelict in their duties with regard to crowd control during the incident, and as it turns out, seeing this footage that was released by one Tucker Carlson over the course of the last week, it appears that they might have been more than cooperative with some of the people from a mental, from a psychological, from a political standpoint than we were led to believe. As I've stated over and over again, there's no conspiracy theory here. Frankly, it's incompetence that generally explains most of the things that happen on a macro level in our world. But just as we see what looks like on its face is complicity by law enforcement with these criminal elements, whether it be Bill Cosby, whether it be Larry Nassar, Jerry Sandusky, or Alec Murdaugh, there appears to be a dichotomy in these cases where either law enforcement has sympathetic aims with these people, or they just realize that the gravity of taking them on is too great. They don't want to take on that challenge. I think there is a combination of both of these elements that exist within law enforcement and then very likely exist within us. Look at the Capitol Police incident on January 6th. They were grossly understaffed. They were grossly under-equipped. And now that you see some of the stories about how there were different insurrectionists, let's use that term, different insurrectionists that were led through the Capitol building by Capitol Police, more than incompetence, it leads one to believe there was some sympathy with the aims of those insurrectionists within the Capitol Police Department. And as I've said over and over again on this podcast, two things can be true at the same time. You can have in one part of the Capitol building a very violent, a very turbulent situation between the Capitol Police, and let's call them insurrectionists, and the insurrectionists. And yet at the same time, in another area of the Capitol building, you have Capitol Police escorting insurrectionists through the building to get to where they want to go. Now, I've heard this opinion being proffered that, well, once the insurrectionists breached the building, then Capitol Police simply wanted to de-escalate the situation, and therefore they weren't going to take any violent or physical action with any of these, again, insurrectionists. And the video completely contradicts this assertion. You had areas where the Capitol Police basically opened up the barricades so that the insurrectionists could breach the Capitol building. You had situations where you had multiple Capitol Police surrounding individual insurrectionists and escorting them where? To the floor of the Senate. The place where they made the videos that were published and that were used to indict them and convict them of these crimes. And regardless of whether or not it's sympathy with the Ames or it's a failure to understand the gravity of the situation, or it's a recognition of the gravity of the situation and a failure to take it on, it's just too big, it's too much work. Often what we see is a short-term indictment of law enforcement, but over the long term, they get to fail up. The answer is to provide law enforcement with more resources in order to, quote-unquote, bridge the gaps that existed in order to have a circumstance or a situation like a Jeffrey Epstein. So what incentive is there to get better? What incentive is there to have a more favorable outcome? If you can continue through incompetence or sympathy with the aims of accused perpetrators, or just a failure and unwillingness to tackle such huge cases with such high-profile perpetrators, if the long-term outcome is getting to fail up, is getting more resources, is getting more money, why would things ever change? There's this story about one of the Capitol Police officers reaching out to one of the, let's just call them insurrectionists, because people like to use that term, reaching out to one of the insurrectionists on Facebook and telling that person, hey, you should take down the video that you've posted on Facebook of entering the Capitol building, because anyone who stepped foot in there is going to be prosecuted, convicted, and put in jail. I'm sympathetic to your aims, and I don't want to see that happen to you. How many other officers had the same sentiment? Is that why in different parts of the Capitol building there were officers that were letting people come through barricades? There were people who were being escorted through the Capitol building? Was that sentiment so pervasive that from a policy standpoint, at the highest levels of the Capitol Police, it was believed that a crowd of Trump supporters would not get out of hand, would not quote-unquote riot? Or was it believed from a policy standpoint at the highest levels of the Capitol Police that Donald Trump did in fact win the election, that he was getting screwed, and that any quote-unquote breach of the Capitol building by the people would be justified? We had a lackluster, that's probably a mild word for it. We had a lackluster hearing on the January 6th incident, and it really revealed very little with regard to how it all went down, what the failures were of law enforcement, whether it be the FBI or Capitol Police. Again, the FBI can be thrown in there because apparently they had informants, they had sources inside all of these different groups that had decided to convene on the Capitol building that day. Because that hearing was so lackluster and the media is not going to do any real investigating into the failures of the Capitol Police and the FBI on that day, my comment, my opinion is, this is just routine. This is just more of the same. How am I supposed to get so much more upset over this incident than the other incident versus the other incident versus the other incident? who needs to change? It's us. Of course it is. That's the way this system is built. We provide the inputs, the system produces the outputs. Until we are ready to make that change, we're just going to continue to get more of the same. And if we're going to continue to get more of the same, at least the one thing that we can control is our reaction.
Act 3, it's time for a cleanse.
I started a cleanse this week. It's been long overdue, in my opinion. I never really felt right. I never really felt normal myself, if you will, after COVID. I've talked about it on the podcast, the fact that really I can't drink anymore. And not only can I not drink, there are certain foods that just irritate the hell out of me as well that never did prior to my having COVID. Maybe it was the ayahuasca experience. For the sake of those of you who have not listened to that, there's a ayahuasca supercast now that's episode 3 of this very season, season 3. You can listen to that. I also have episodes chronicling from the first season my bout with COVID. Regardless of the reason, whether it's my getting older, COVID, my experience, if you will, with Mother Ayahuasca, there are foods that certainly cause me discomfort. There is now a complete and total inability to process alcohol. And I figured, well, let's clean the system out. So I got this cleanse. It's called Cleanse 21. You can Google that. It's a company out of California, of course. And it's 21 days of this cleanse formula. They basically have their own proprietary shake. They have a proprietary vitamin pack, and they have a proprietary digestion pill. And there's also a hydration pack. You get all of this for 21 days, and you're going to have, for that 21 days, one quote-unquote pre-approved meal, and they give you a list of foods that you can eat from for that 21 days. So in sum, a couple of shakes a day with vitamins and one pre-approved meal. So I thought, why not chronicle my journey through this cleanse on the podcast, see if it's actually worth a damn. If it's a success, perhaps it could influence one of the 50 to 60 people that actually listen to this podcast on a weekly basis. And if it's a failure, you'll know to avoid it. Now, I'm sure that many of you are saying to yourselves, well, I don't want to eat just one meal a day. Neither did I. I was not excited about having one, and let's be clear, pre-approved meal per day. No carbohydrates, no gluten, no corn, very, very limited. And you have to be diligent. Very limited in your sugar intake. Everything today has sugar in it. So you are very limited in the things that are on this pre-approved list. And frankly, I just have cut out fruits altogether during this cleanse to stay away from the sugar. The idea behind a lot of these cleanses is simply cleaning out the microbiome in your gut. And there's all sorts of different types of bacteria, of microscopic, creepy, crawly critters working in your gut biome. And frankly, a lot of the worst ones, as much as they crave anything, they crave sugar. I'm not sure to what extent any of you are up to date on the research about alcohol and the way it's processed in the body. The prevailing wisdom has always been that it's the alcohol in alcohol that so addicts us to it and causes us so many of its negative reactions, the negative things that we have to overcome, a hangover, liver and kidney problems, after mass consumption. And that may be true, but it's the sugar that is now being identified as the culprit for our tendency, our desire to crave alcohol. Sugar, sugar, sugar. So cutting sugar out during this cleanse, to me, was vitally important. If you look at your sugar intake, even if you consider yourself a healthy person on a day-to-day basis, it's shocking when you start looking at the foods that you eat that you think are healthy, that you think are at least absent of a lot of these different types of preservatives and chemicals, there's a hell of a lot of sugar in it. Everybody wants to demonize high fructose corn syrup, and if you listen to any of the scientists who do any of the research, the reality is that sugar is sugar. That high fructose corn syrup, it's not that much worse for you than some of these natural sugars, mango sugar, brown rice sugar, tapioca sugar. Sugar is sugar. The more we consume it, the more problems we have. For my nutritious alcohol, it is the catalyst. It's yeast, and you have to give it some sugar. So I'm going through this cleanse. I'm identifying everything in my diet, in my pantry, in my refrigerator that has excess sugar, that has corn, that has gluten, at least for 21 days to eliminate them. Now, some of you may be thinking, wow, I'd like to do a cleanse like this. How much does it cost? Yes, there's a cost. And believe me, I didn't get it for free because I'm going to chronicle it on this podcast. The at most 100 downloads that I get per episode, sometimes a couple hundred, did not warrant a free cleanse kit. With tax, it was about $440. That's right, $440. You get a discount for being a new client. I think it's 10%. And with tax, the total came to $440. Now, if you factor that in with you're eating one, again, pre-approved meal a day for these 21 days, when I budgeted it out, the grocery bill is not going to be nearly as much as it was when I was eating 2 to 3 meals a day. So it averaged out over the course of that 3 weeks, I'm spending the same amount on food, on my grocery bill. That's how I justified in my own mind paying the $440 in order to get this kit. Not only did I want to see what it could do for me, changing my health, changing my relationship to food, changing my relationship to certain things that I drink, namely alcohol. In the grand scheme of things, it really isn't costing me any more from a monetary standpoint at the grocery store. As of today, I'm 4 days in. How do I feel? I feel hungry. I'm well aware after having fasted in my life for more than 3 days that you go through a cycle of desire, of craving in the very beginning of any type of dietary cleanse of a fast. It's both a mental exercise and a physical exercise. Mentally, you were challenged because you feel hungry, and it often will cause you a headache, if not just a brain fog. Not so much a headache, but just you're not nearly as sharp because your body is adjusting to this change in calories and a lack of calories. So it affects you mentally. Physically, of course, you're hungry. Your body is used to a certain amount of calories coming in and a certain amount of, let's just be frank, bad calories, a lot of different types of processed foods, a lot of different types of sugars. When you take that away, your body is going to physically react, and it's going to physically react, namely, in the first 72, 96 hours. So I'm in the throes of that now. I've never done a fast for longer than a week, and I've never done a cleanse for longer than a week. So I'm in somewhat charted territory. Next week, I will be in, if I'm diligent and I stick to this diet, which I have every intention of doing, I will be in uncharted territory. And in that uncharted territory is where I want to memorialize what is going on via this podcast.
Act 4, let's talk about money and retirement.
So I've started this new career, and I don't want to come on this podcast and start basically pitching my wares, yet I am passionate about what I'm doing, and I believe in it. So I'm not sure how I can not come on here and talk about it. So one of the things I'm going to try to do over the course of this season is present this information as I see it in a neutral way, not so much to peddle wares, but to try and educate. And to the extent that we're all dealing with issues of money, of security, let's see if we can't have a conversation that better elucidates what we want to do, what our goals are, and what we need to do in order to achieve them. And that's where I want to start on this topic of money, of life insurance and annuities, and of our traditional or qualified retirement accounts, the 401k or the IRA. Just like you, dear listener, for a long time, I believed that life insurance was trash because everyone on the television and everyone on the internet, everyone that actually had some sort of input into the financial markets was saying life insurance is trash. I mean, there is a term of art that is very popular now when it comes to life insurance. Buy term, invest the rest. And that has served the financial industry very well because there's a lot of money coming from individuals, from individual investors like you and me into the market versus going into other types of investment vehicles, of financial plans. Now, that's not a bad thing in and of itself. Frankly, the market has been going up over the course of the last decade. There was a lot of money to be made in putting your money in the market. I made money putting it into the market. The interesting thing about the market is it's like a craps table. Everyone looks like a genius when the market keeps going up. If no one rolls a 7, then everyone continues to make money on the table. But the 7 is coming. The 7 is always coming. You look at any historical graph or chart, the market over the course of the last 100 years, the 7 is always coming. And who looks like a genius when the 7 is rolled and then you get a series of 7s or 11s being rolled? Who actually can continue to make money in those markets? How is your investment or retirement portfolio affected by those continual 7s or 11s when the market isn't performing, when the market's in the negative? A lot of the financial education out there, it's very teacher-student oriented. It's 1, 2, maybe a group of people educating, really lecturing the rest of us on here's what we should do and here's what we should not do. And I'm going to try to take a different approach, ask some questions that I didn't ask of myself for years openly on this podcast and see if it doesn't trigger in some of you the types of questions that you should be asking in order to be confident about your financial future. The first question, and it's the simplest, I contributed to a 401k for years. For years. If there was a match, I contributed up to the match and sometimes in excess of the match. A question that I never asked was, if I continue to contribute at the current rate, what is my projected account value when I want to stop working, when I want to retire, and how much would that total account value produce for me in monthly or annual income to maintain my lifestyle? A lot of us may end up downsizing when we retire, getting a smaller house, not having the 2, 3, 4 cars because the kids are out of the house. What we want to believe is that is going to be a conscious decision, that we're going to be able to weigh all of the different options that we have. We're going to be able to downsize. We're going to be able to retire to a location that's more desirable than where we're living. But what the data shows, and what you hear a lot of complaints from the baby boomer generation, they don't have a choice. They have to downsize in retirement because, as it's termed now in the media, they didn't save enough money. I want you to really think about that, dear listener, that the way this is framed is these people didn't save enough money, and that's why they're being forced to downsize, or that's why they're being forced to continue working well after they thought they'd be able to stop working or retire. Did those people, and we're talking about tens of millions of people, did those people actually fail to save enough to retire? Or did those people never ask the fundamental question that I didn't ask of myself? If I keep saving at the rate that I'm saving, if I keep doing everything that I'm being told to do, am I going to have enough money in retirement to live the lifestyle that I want? In my new role, I've asked that question of a number of people, and they don't have the answer, and they don't have any idea about how to find out what the answer is. People with 6 figures in their 401k or in their IRA, and they can't answer how much is this account projected to be worth? What's the value when I elect to retire? And because those are qualified accounts, you really can't touch that money until 59 and a half without having to jump through a ton of different types of hoops. What is the account value projected to be when I want to retire? And how much is that going to produce me in monthly or annual income so I know how to budget for the lifestyle I want to lead? Some of these newer portals where people can access their 401k or their IRA, they actually have a calculator or they have some sort of graphic that projects out what the account should be worth when they're ready to retire or when they're actually eligible to withdraw the money, and how much that account will produce in monthly or annual income. Google, dear listener, 2 different terms: the Trinity study, TRINITY, that's right, just like the Matrix, the Trinity study, and sequence of returns risk. The Trinity study came out, it was a study that was put together to determine what is the optimal or the ideal withdrawal rate from a 401k or IRA in retirement so that the money doesn't run out before you die. That number was 4%. 4% of the amount that you have in the account can come out annually in order to sustain your lifestyle while in retirement so that you don't run out of money before you die. Why 4%? Why so little? Sequence of returns risk. Go ahead and look that up. When you get to retirement, you don't have time to suffer any type of market downturn. You'll lose too much value in the money that you have that's generating any interest that you'd be able to withdraw from your account to live on. Does that make sense? Understand the way that these accounts are set up, you're going to have a principal amount in your quote-unquote retirement account. And that money is going to be generating interest or more money. Based on the amount of money that your money is generating, you can withdraw that every year, and you should have enough money to last you until you pass away. Because a downturn in the market when you first retire can cost you tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. Again, Google sequence of returns risk. Many financial advisors advocate that you put your money in more conservative investments. You can't afford the risk of loss, particularly as you are approaching retirement or after you have retired. So, because you're putting your money into more conservative investments, and those more conservative investments that are less risky, less likely to suffer any consequence from a market downturn, they also have a lower rate of return. More risk, higher return; less risk, lower return. When you need the money the most, your rate of return is lower. Even at 4 or 5%, you're not only taking the amount of interest that money is earning you every year, but you're eating into the principal, and you're slowly doing so over the course of the rest of your life. Now, let's get back to the baby boomers and the fact that we have been led to believe, we have been educated that many of them that are struggling now just failed to save enough. They are responsible. It's the individual that's responsible. What if, dear listener, it's not the individual, it's the system? And what if the system didn't really deceive anyone? What if the deception was that we just trusted blindly that if we did what we were told, we would end up where we wanted to go? If you go and look at what your retirement account is projected to be when you elect to retire and how much income that is going to produce you, I think you'd be shocked. Many people, if they have close to $1 million, and understand, there's only about 2% It's actually, I believe, less than 2% of the retirement accounts in this country that have $1 million or more inside of them when people retire. That retirement account, according to the Trinity study, let's say you're going to be liberal and take 5%, $50,000 a year. You're going to be conservative, take 4% or less, that's $40,000 a year. I hear people say, well, you could take more money. Yes, you can. But the more money you take, the less money you have working for you to generate interest in the later years of your retirement. Therefore, the more money you take, the higher the likelihood that you're going to run out of money before you die. And that's when you see many of these seniors have to go into what are less than reputable assisted living facilities, retirement homes. Moreover, when do you need the money the most based on your life expectancy? Very often, it's when you're close to passing because the medical bills in the later stages of life are exorbitant. We can keep people alive for longer than we ever have in the course of human history. What's the quality of life? Well, maybe it's piss poor, but we can keep the people alive. And in order to do so, the people have to pay. Another common misconception is that Medicare will cover all of the expenses. It's just not true. Medicare does not cover all of the expenses of a lot of the hospitalizations that seniors have late in their lives. So the money that they have is very important, not only for their comfort, for their quality of life when they first retire, but in order to take care of them when they are actually closer to dying. The point of this segment is simple. Please go out, look at the portal that you have for your 401k, for your IRA, see what it's projected to be worth when you want to retire. And again, because those are qualified accounts with several exceptions that are actually not that easy to navigate, you can't use that money until you're 59 and a half. See how much they're projected to be worth, and then see how much that amount is projected to produce for you in monthly or annual income, so that you understand what kind of lifestyle that you can lead when you want to retire. This is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast.